The red dust of the outback doesn't give a damn about a broken heart. It blows right through the cracks in the timber of Oodnadatta like it wants to erase the whole settlement off the map. In the blistering December of 1898, that barren stretch of South Australia was the only thing Elara Vance had left to her name. At 25, Elara was already wearing widow's weeds. Her youth had been scoured away by the brutal reality of the scrublands. Her husband, Silas, was a man who tried to crack the earth, but the earth swallowed him instead. He left her a sprawling sheep station, an untapped artesian basin, and a bullseye painted squarely on her back. Out in the scrub, a reliable water source wasn't just a lucky find, it was something worth slitting throats over. The men circling her property weren't the glamorous bushrangers you read about in penny dreadfuls. They were her neighbors, the O'Reilly outfit, Declan, Mick, and the young runaway Finn. They played a sick, twisting game they called the starving. For one blistering fortnight that summer, the O'Reillys rode out to the boundary fence 3 times a day just to make sure Elara felt the weight of her isolation. Morning, noon, and dead of night when the dingoes started howling. They called it the starving because they wanted her exhausted, terrified, and desperate enough to throw the deed at 'em. It was a relentless war of nerves, engineered to crush a woman's spine until she begged them to take everything. But the O'Reillys were completely ignorant of the fact that a ghost had just drifted into the basin. A woman dragging a heavy sack of sins and possessing the kind of brutal talents polite society tries to ignore. Now, if you still reckon a promise means a damn thing in this ruined world, pour yourself a stiff drink and settle in. Tell me, is the wind rattling your windows where you're sitting tonight? Let's get back to the red dirt. Let's go back to that scorching Tuesday morning when the heat haze was thick as syrup and a lone rider crested the eastern ridge. My name was Maeve Sullivan. I was 42 years old, and I moved with the stiff, aching caution of a woman who had been beaten to a pulp and left for dead more times than I care to admit. I rode on to the Vance station just as the morning sun threatened to bake the land alive. I didn't arrive with a brass band or a sheriff's badge. I showed up because 6 years ago, Silas Vance dragged my bleeding carcass out of a burning pub in Alice Springs and didn't ask for a single penny for the trouble. I'd spent my entire adult life doing ugly work for bad people. The kind of woman men gossiped about in filthy saloons but never dared to challenge face to face. They called me the Crimson Widow up in the Northern Territories, a bad omen wrapped in gun smoke and bad intentions. Down here I was just a drifter wearing a riding coat caked in the filth of 3 deserts, sitting on a mare that was just as tired as my own soul. I'd sworn to Silas I'd keep Elara breathing if the wolves ever came knocking. Silas caught a bad chest infection, a terribly ordinary death for a bloke who'd survived droughts, floods, and feral men. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. Some debts just sit heavy in your gut, refusing to digest. The world I'd walked away from was practically screaming for some bloodshed. I nudged my mare into the thick salt bush behind the shearing shed right as the 3 O'Reillys trotted up. I didn't draw my iron. A smart butcher always takes a good look at the slaughterhouse before she starts swinging the cleaver. Declan O'Reilly was built like a rusted boiler, squat, dense, and corrupted all the way through to his rotten core. He sat comfortably on a massive grey gelding, glaring down at Elara. Elara was standing out on her veranda, gripping a heavy iron fireplace poker. "Mornin', Mrs. Vance. Declan hollered, his voice a muddy grind that sounded like crushing rocks. Alara didn't blink, even though her knuckles were practically bursting through her pale skin. She'd already taken a few pot shots at the O'Reillys earlier that week. It didn't drive 'em off, but it proved she still had teeth. "You're trespassing early today, Declan," she fired back, her voice remarkably steady considering the three men were eyeing her like wild dogs cornering a lamb. "Just making sure the fences are holding up," Mick O'Reilly chirped with a nasty wet grin. Mick was the middle brother, a lean, twitchy bastard who clearly loved the sound of people crying. He smirked whenever someone flinched, acting like terror was an expensive gin he couldn't stop drinking. Young Finn, barely 19, just sat in his saddle, his eyes darting around with the pathetic guilt of a coward. "The deal hasn't changed, Alara," Declan stated, leaning heavily against his saddle horn like a bloated vulture. 300 quid for the whole lot, and we won't burn this farmhouse down with you inside it." Alara spat right into the red dirt, the ultimate middle finger in the outback. "This basin is worth 20 times your filthy offer, and you know Silas would have sooner shot you dead than sell to a maggot like you." Declan's ugly face flushed to the color of a bruised peach. "Silas is rotting under the dirt, girl. Pride is a terribly expensive thing for a lonely widow to hold on to." He tipped his greasy hat. It wasn't polite. It was a promise of violence. "We'll be back at sundown for your signature. I suggest you find some manners by then." They spurred their horses, kicking up a massive cloud of suffocating red dust that coated Alara's freshly swept floorboards. I stayed tucked away in the shadows, watching the exact second her spine finally gave out. I saw her collapse onto the top step, burying her face in her hands for exactly 3 seconds. No more, no less. Then she took a shaky breath, smoothed out her faded dress, and gripped her poker again. That was the exact moment I realized I wasn't just here to balance a ledger. I was here to start a massacre. I stepped out from behind the timber, my heavy boots crunching loudly against the baked earth. Alara whipped around, her free hand diving into her pocket for a revolver. She was damn fast, I'll give her that. But I was already standing completely still, keeping my hands empty and visible, looking for all the world like a lost drover. "Silas always bragged you had a fire in you," I said softly. Alara froze, her dark eyes narrowing as she sized me up. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded. "An old friend of your husband's and your new shadow," my voice rough as sandpaper. "I'm Maeve Sullivan, and I absolutely despise owing a favor to a corpse," I told her straight. Alara lowered the iron poker, but her knuckles stayed white. Back in the 90s, any stranger wandering the scrub was usually a bushwhacker looking for an easy mark. She glared right back at me. "I don't want your charity, Maeve, and I certainly don't want to dig another grave when they shoot you on my porch." I walked over to the rusted iron pump and started drawing water for my mare. The handle squealed like a dying pig. "This isn't charity. I'm here to deal with the O'Reillys. I've watched men exactly like them from the top end down to the coast. They prance around acting like apex predators because they've cornered a bleeding calf. They haven't run into a real monster yet." Alara's eyes dropped to my gun belt. I carry matched Webley revolvers. The grips are worn completely smooth. They aren't pretty, and I don't polish them for show. They look exactly like tools that have put a lot of people in the ground. "They promised to be back right at midday," Alara warned, her voice tight, "and they aren't coming to negotiate." I drank straight from the wooden bucket, letting the tepid water wash the dust out of my throat. Good. The brutal midday sun is the only way to get a proper look at a man's true character.
The next few hours slipped by in absolute silence. I didn't waste time dramatically oiling my weapons or staring meaningfully at the horizon. I already knew my guns. I asked Alara for a spool of heavy shearing twine and whatever rusted tin cans she had lying around the rubbish pile. I moved around the station's perimeter, thinking about the layout. I wasn't planning to hold a fortress. I just needed to make sure overconfident idiots galloped directly into a nightmare. Men like the O'Reillys understand how to run cattle, but they are utterly clueless about the psychology of an ambush. I had their measure already. Declan was pure bloated ego. Mick was just a sadist. Finn was a terrified kid who probably regretted ever stealing a horse to join his brothers. I strung the thick twine low across the main dirt track, burying it under a layer of loose red sand so it vanished completely in the harsh glare. I hung the tin cans out in the dry mulga scrub, positioning them so the afternoon breeze would make them rattle randomly. Alara watched me from the kitchen window. She had been living under a blanket of pure terror for so long that watching me work must have felt like a bizarre hallucination. Around 11:30, she walked out carrying a plate of stale damper and some cold salted mutton. Right as I took the plate, a rifle cracked somewhere out past the boundary fence. It wasn't a shot meant to hit anyone. It was just an echo meant to remind us they were coming. "Why did Silas bother saving you?" she asked, her voice barely carrying over the wind. I chewed a piece of the tough meat, watching the heat shimmer on the horizon. Because I was an absolute idiot who thought I could outrun a fire in Alice Springs. Silas didn't know me from a bar of soap, but he walked right into a burning pub anyway. He told me a human life was worth more than a timber shack. I've spent the last 6 years trying to prove he wasn't completely wrong about me. And Laura stared at my hands. They were steady. Hers were shaking uncontrollably. "They're going to slaughter you, Maeve," she whispered. "Declan owns the local magistrate. The whole town just looks the other way." I swallowed the last of the damper and stood up. My bad knee cracked loudly. "The law is a beautiful thing when you're sitting in a parlor, Alara, but out here in the dust, the only law is the lead in your cylinder. Lock the heavy door and don't come out until the screaming stops." Right at midday, the sun was a punishing white hole in the sky. The heavy thud of hooves started echoing through the basin. It sounded like a storm rolling in. I didn't stand out on the veranda waiting to catch a bullet. I grabbed an old timber chair and sat deep in the suffocating shadows of the shearing shed. The 3 O'Reillys rode right into the yard. Their horses were lathered in white sweat and acting extremely nervous. The station was dead quiet. Alara had locked the dogs in the back room. The only sound was the dry wind hitting the corrugated iron roof. "Mrs. Vance," Declan bellowed, his massive gray horse spinning in tight circles. "It's midday. Bring out the deed and a pen." Nobody answered. A loose piece of tin banged against the water tank. Mick spat a stream of tobacco and yanked his pistol out, his eyes wide and feverish. "I reckon the widow needs a little motivation, Declan," he laughed, aiming right at the front window. I spoke up then. My voice was dry and grated like a rusted hinge in the quiet yard. "I really wouldn't pull that trigger if I were you, boy." The brothers violently jerked their horses around to face the shed, hands dropping to their holsters. I stayed sitting, resting my hands flat on my thighs. "Who the hell is out there?"
Declan roared, his ugly face twisting into something genuinely hateful. "Just a neighbor who hates the noise," I told him. "You three make an awful lot of racket for such a small patch of dirt." Declan let out a harsh, barking laugh that sounded like a dog choking on a bone. "Looks like another stray wanting a shallow grave. Mick, show this bitch what we do to trespassers." Mick didn't think twice. He kicked his horse hard, charging straight at the shed with his gun raised. He completely missed the tripwire. The thick twine caught his horse's front legs at a full gallop. The animal collapsed like it had been struck by lightning. Mick launched over the horse's neck and hit the baked earth with a sickening wet crunch. His gun flew off into the salt bush. I didn't even stand up. I just watched the skinny bastard groan and spit blood into the dirt. "First lesson of the outback," I said calmly. "Watch where the hell you ride." Declan screamed something unintelligible and grabbed for his revolver. I was much faster. I didn't rely on youth. I relied on muscle memory. I drew my Webley and fired a round straight into the dirt 2 inches from Declan's horse. The animal shrieked, bolted sideways, and nearly dumped Declan onto his fat head. Declan desperately fought the reins, getting dragged halfway across the dusty yard before he regained control. Young Finn was completely paralyzed. He sat there, hands shaking so violently the leather reins were slapping his horse's neck. "Scrape your brother off the ground and get out of here," I ordered. I kept my voice dead flat. "That was your midday warning. The sundown visit is going to be entirely different. If I catch any of you on this property after the sun dips behind the ridge, I'm going to stop shooting the dirt and start putting holes in your chests." Mick managed to stagger up, clutching his shoulder at a highly unnatural angle. He looked like he was going to vomit. Declan glared at me, his eyes burning with the kind of humiliated rage that usually gets people killed. "You're a dead woman," Declan hissed, spitting dust out of his mouth. "We'll be back at dusk, and we won't be wasting time talking." They rolled out, with Mick awkwardly clinging to the back of Finn's saddle. They left behind nothing but a smeared trail of blood and swirling red sand. The heavy silence fell back over the station. I finally stood up and dropped the Webley back into its holster. I looked down and noticed a very slight tremor in my right hand. Getting old is just a slow, humiliating robbery. It strips your nerves away, one tiny tremor at a time, until you're jumping at shadows. Alara finally unlocked the heavy timber door. She stepped out onto the veranda with a look that sat somewhere between absolute awe and pure, unfiltered panic. "You actually hurt them," she breathed, staring at the smeared blood in the dirt. "I inconvenienced them," I corrected, wiping the red grit off my revolver. "Declan operates on pure, bloated pride. He thinks he's a king out here. He won't stop until he's nailed my hide to the shearing shed. He's gonna ride into town, buy a dozen hired guns with cheap rum, and come back looking to slaughter us." Alara slowly walked down the wooden steps. She ignored the warning in my voice and stared hard at my ruined face, studying the deep scars crossing my cheek. "Who exactly are you, Maeve? You didn't just share a pint with Silas in a pub." I turned away and looked out at the vast, shimmering expanse of the salt pan. I was his older sister. I said it quietly. The words felt entirely foreign in my mouth. Alara blinked. Her jaw practically dropped. Silas never spoke about his family. "He wasn't exactly proud of me, Alara," I explained. The wind was picking up, throwing sharp red grit against my heavy leather coat. Silas walked toward the light. He wanted to break his back pulling life out of this miserable dirt. I walked the other way. I went straight into the dark. We shared the exact same blood, but our lives couldn't have been more fundamentally different. I kicked a hard clod of dirt into the scrub. He changed his surname to Vance when he came out to South Australia. He did it mostly to leave the Sullivan reputation buried in the Sydney gutters. I kept the name because it's the only goddamn thing I actually own. Laura collapsed onto the porch step. Her mind was visibly spinning, struggling to reconcile the gentle farmer she loved with the scarred killer standing in her yard. "He loved you," she whispered, looking up at me. "He kept these old letters in a tin box under the floorboards. He wrote about a woman who was completely lost to the world but had the heart of a rabid dingo. He was talking about you all along." I felt a sudden sharp lump in my throat that no amount of cheap whiskey could wash away.
"He was 10 times the person I'll ever be," I managed to say, my voice rougher than usual. "And I'm certainly not letting a pack of feral dogs take what he built. Now listen to me closely. They'll be back right at dusk, and they'll bring at least 10 shooters with them. Standing in the open is a very quick way to catch a bullet. We're going to let the outback kill them. Out here, the terrain is nothing but jagged ironstone and blinding dust. I spent the next 2 grueling hours dragging Alara up to the old abandoned copper mine shaft on the northern ridge. It was a partially collapsed tunnel with only one treacherous, narrow path leading up. I shoved my spare Webley revolver directly into her hands. "If anyone walks up this track and it isn't me, pull the damn trigger. Don't think about it. Don't warn them. The O'Reillys don't understand mercy. They only understand hot lead and consequence." I left her shaking in the dark and went back down to the homestead. I grabbed a heavy axe and started systematically destroying the holding pens Silas had built. I turned the yard into a nightmare maze of jagged timber and loose, rusty barbed wire. Right as the sun hit the horizon, a massive red dust storm rolled over the basin, a proper outback haboob. It swallowed the sky entirely, choking the air and dropping visibility to less than 10 feet. The world turned into a suffocating, blood-red nightmare filled with swirling grit. I stood dead in the center of the ruined yard, letting the hot wind tear at my coat. I didn't feel scared. When you spend over 40 years fully expecting to die violently, the capacity for fear eventually just burns out. I heard the horses long before I saw 'em. It was a heavy, muffled thudding cutting through the howling wind. "Sullivan!" Declan's voice practically ripped through the dust. He sounded disconnected, yelling blindly into the void. "I've brought the magistrate's deputies with me. You're a wanted bitch. Hand over the property deed and the widow, and I might just let you hang comfortably in town instead of bleeding out in the dirt." I didn't bother yelling back. Words are useless against greedy men. I simply raised my revolver and fired 1 round straight up into the roaring sky. Then I vanished into the red wall of dust. The hired hands immediately panicked, firing blindly into the blinding wind. I started whistling an old, deeply depressing Irish wake song Silas and I used to hear as kids. The eerie melody drifted through the howling wind, echoing weirdly off the corrugated iron roof. It spooked the horses terribly, chilling the blood of the men riding them. "Where the hell is she?" Mick screamed. His voice was high-pitched and frantic. He was clearly still agonizing over his shattered collarbone. I yanked the master line I'd run to the rusted tin cans out in the scrub. The sudden chaotic clattering sent the hired thugs completely over the edge.
They started shooting at moving shadows, hitting the water tank, the timber beams, and eventually each other. This is the kind of raw, psychological terror that ruins a man long before a bullet actually finds him. The mercenaries broke fast. They were pub brawlers, not soldiers. Getting paid $5 wasn't worth catching friendly fire in a blinding sandstorm. Horses bolted blindly into the thick salt bush. Men screamed in the dark as they tangled themselves in the hidden barbed wire left out. Somewhere in the red haze, a bloke shrieked for his horse, but nobody answered. Within 5 minutes, the yard was utterly empty, except for Declan and Mick. Finn had run at the first gunshot. I stepped out of the swirling dust, stopping exactly 10 feet in front of Declan. The red dirt parted just enough for him to see my leather coat and the black, unblinking barrel of my Webley aimed at his gut. "We're done here, Declan," I said. My voice was dead and hollow, completely cutting through the howl of the storm. "Your hired guns ran away. Your youngest brother is probably halfway to Port Augusta by now. Nobody cares about a dead cattle thief." Declan was hyperventilating heavily. His bloated face was streaming with sweat and trapped dirt. He looked absolutely terrified. He tried to raise his gun, but his fat hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold it. His spirit was completely shattered. I didn't pull the trigger. I walked right up to him and violently kicked his hand, sending his heavy revolver into the mud. "You aren't even worth the ammunition, you fat bastard," I spat. The absolute disgust in my voice made him flinch harder than a gunshot would have. "You're just a pathetic little man who got rich by scaring people much weaker than you. Silas built something real here, and you thought you could just steal it because you're a bully. But the bush always collects its debts, and tonight I'm the collector." Declan fell to his knees in the red dirt, finally realizing the game was over.
"You are going to pack up and leave Udnadada, Declan. You will sign those property deeds over to Ilara first thing tomorrow morning." I leaned in close enough to smell the stale beer and fear sweating out of his pores. "You have exactly 24 hours to vanish. If I ever hear you cross back onto this station, I swear to God I will burn every single shearing shed you own while you sleep inside. Next time I catch your ugly face out here, I won't bother stringing up twine. I'll just use a hangman's knot." Declan slumped forward into the wet, red mud. The sheer reality of his own pathetic insignificance finally hit him. He was nothing. The sick little game of the starving was permanently over, buried forever under the heavy outback dust. By the time dawn broke the next day, the furious sandstorm had completely passed. The morning sky was a brilliant, bruised purple, and the air smelled sharply of crushed eucalyptus and wet earth. I stood in the doorway of the tiny, sweltering magistrate's office in town, watching Declan aggressively scratch his signature onto the parchment. His fat hand was shaking so badly he nearly tore the parchment. The locals huddled in the corners, watching us in absolute dead silence. The whispers about the Crimson Widow had finally caught up to the reality of the woman standing in their miserable town. I couldn't care less about the terrified gossiper cowards. I walked the 3 miles back to the boundary fence where Ilara was waiting on the veranda. The heavy, suffocating exhaustion was finally gone from her dark eyes. "You've saddled your mare," she noted, her voice tight as she looked at my packed saddlebags. I turned and looked up at the rocky hill where Silas was buried.
The harsh morning sun was bouncing off the rough ironstone marker Alara had dragged up there. "I have a few more ugly debts I need to settle down in Adelaide," I told her quietly, "but I reckon I'll ride back up this way eventually. Silas always bragged this basin was the only decent place on earth to watch the sky turn red." Alara stepped off the porch and grabbed my calloused, scarred hand. She squeezed it hard. "You saved my life, Maeve." I shook my head slightly. "Silas pulled me out of the fire first. I'm just paying the tab. Keep the artesian bull clean and don't let any blokes ride up to your front door unless they're carrying wildflowers." I tipped the brim of my battered hat, climbed stiffly into the saddle and nudged my mare south along the main dirt track. I didn't look back at the farmhouse, but I could feel the brutal, honest warmth of the sun hitting my shoulders. For the first time in decades, I actually felt human again. I wasn't just a loaded gun or a bloody rumor people whispered about in the dark corners of filthy pubs. I was an exhausted older sister who finally kept a promise. Now, as an old woman sitting here sharing this memory, I need you to understand something vital. The world is always going to be infested with O'Reillys, greedy bastards who take simply because nobody stops them. But this broken world also breeds women like me, people who sit quietly in the shadows and wait for the dust storm to hit. Never let the midnight terrors break your spine. Just make sure your nerve holds and your boundary lines are tight. Being decent is a brutal choice you have to make every single day. If you want to hear more about the hard people who made that choice out in the scrub, hit the subscribe button. Tell me down in the comments, who was the crimson widow in your life? Who stood in front of you when the smoke was too thick to see the way out? Until our tracks cross again, keep your powder bone dry and your soul unbroken. The desert wind keeps howling, stripping the blood off the ironstone, but the red dirt always remembers. It remembers the scarred woman who rode out of the dust to balance the scales, and the widow who dug her heels in when the world tried to bury her.